going.
Welcome to this evening's semi-final debate. My name is Chichi and I'm the chairman of this debate. The timekeeper is Todd Fagati and this debate will be judged by a panel of 3 adjudicators who are Ms. Chor, Mr. Hazel and Ms. Harana. The topic of this debate is that voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented in South Australia. The affirmative team seated to my right is St. Peter's Girls. The negative team seated to my left is from Westminster School. The speaking time for this debate is 5 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. Please ensure that your mobile phones are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Zihan Hua.
Good evening, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented in South Australia. We, the affirmative team, define the topic as voluntary to indicate how requests for euthanasia can only be placed by the patient and can only be accepted if their condition is intolerable. This request can be revoked by the patient at any time before their death, and euthanasia being the practice of intentionally ending a life to relieve pain and suffering. This occurs through a physician administering a fatal dose of a suitable drug to the patient on his or her express request. We also state that euthanasia can also be provided to certain people and not those who are mentally unwell. We, the affirmative team, strongly believe that this statement is true. Today, as first speaker, I will be talking to you about the generalized reasons as freedom of choices, and that euthanasia provides a safe and legal environment is a justification for euthanasia to be introduced. Our second speaker will be talking about the reasons as to why it should be introduced in the state of South of Australia, which are the strict process involving euthanasia in the South Australian health system. Now to my first point. It is essential that patients are given the freedom of choice. For many people considering euthanasia, they are suffering from great pain due to a terminal illness. Euthanasia gives the suffering patient the choice to end their pain and suffering in a safe and legal way. Jenny Mikakus, the state's health minister, said in a statement that euthanasia is about giving people who are suffering intolerably from an incurable disease a voluntary, compassionate choice over the manner of their death. It is important that we give painless option to people suffering. In addition, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all humans are born free. Humans are entitled to freedom, and that includes freedom to be able to make our own choices. Euthanasia should be a choice that humans have freedom to make. If you don't have control over your own life, do you have your control over anything? Hence, voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented because people have the right to choose euthanasia as it is their life and their choice. Now to my second point. Euthanasia provides a safe and legal environment for the suffering and those around them. Many patients are often in great pain, and it is not uncommon for families to take this into their own hands for the sake of their loved ones. Often, families assist their loved ones to commit suicide because euthanasia isn't an option. Although it's illegal in other countries and states, it can often be far too expensive for those people to travel, leaving them virtually optionless. Family members and friends who assist in suicide can be persecuted by Australian legal system, despite them ultimately doing good for those they care about. Legislation stops their persecution of good people with innocent intentions. Methods taken by people desperate enough to take or help take their life of those suffering can be painful and dangerous. Many methods involve people overdosing on drugs, This method is very illegal and can be extremely painful for those taking their own life. The implementation of euthanasia in South Australia will allow for those suffering to take their own life in a very safe and legal way, which ultimately will protect those around them. In conclusion, we firmly strongly believe that voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented in South Australia because it is completely different to suicide, as the family is supported, and that they should have the right to make their choices. Horace, a Roman poet, once said, "To save a man's life against him would be the same as killing him." Euthanasia is sometimes really what's right for patients to keep the choice away from them. It's inhuman. Thank you.
Madam Chairman.
Call upon the first negative speaker, Emma Deary.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented in South Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, we propose to debate that this statement is false. Although we agree with parts of the definition put forward by the affirmative team, we define voluntary euthanasia as voluntary active euthanasia, which involves a doctor taking an active role in carrying out a competent person's request to end their life by the direct action of delivering a lethal substance to relieve that person from unbearable pain. Also, we consider that voluntary euthanasia is not the same as voluntary assisted suicide or death. The latter relates to people using assistance to kill themselves, not having it administered to them. Today, as first speaker, I will argue that voluntary euthanasia legislation is complex and needs to be seen as a national rather than a state issue, and about the adverse effects on doctors of having the responsibility of enacting this legislation. Our second speaker will discuss 68 safeguards of the law, competency issues and palliative care. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. Before I continue with my team's case, I will rebut the points of the opposition's first speaker. I think that the affirmative team has missed the point of this debate. We are not debating the pros and cons of voluntary euthanasia. We are debating whether the legislation should be implemented in this state. She has also talked about the right to choose. There is never really a right to choose. Someone else or a doctor will be making the last choice. One human can never really understand all of the factors of pain, family and influence that goes into another person's decision to make a choice like this. And now to my points. There is no consensus within Australia about voluntary euthanasia legislation. Individual state and territory attempts to introduce such legislation have repeatedly failed. According to an article in The Conversation in 2016, more than 50 attempts to pass this legislation have been made and failed in various states across Australia. In South Australia, voluntary euthanasia bills have already been debated and defeated 15 times, while the Victorian Voluntary Assisted Dying Act of 2017 was only successful in implemented voluntary assisted death, not voluntary euthanasia as defined by our team. It is therefore clear that voluntary euthanasia is a complex issue which has proved unable to be resolved by the individual states and territories. Given this, we believe that the implementation of this legislation is a national issue that should be vigorously debated and, if successful, enacted consistently across Australia, rather than at a single state or territory level. In our view, it is grossly unfair and inappropriate for some Australians to have access to voluntary euthanasia legislation when other citizens do not. According to the 2016 Australian Human Rights Commission paper entitled Euthanasia, Human Rights and the Law, This view is evidenced by the actions of the Australian government to constitutionally override voluntary euthanasia legislation, which had been implemented in the Northern Territory in March 1996. The Northern Territory legislation had only been in place for 1 year before the Commonwealth Government intervened to abolish it, conveying that this legislation was not equitable to all of Australians. I would also like to talk about the adverse effects on doctors of having the responsibility of enacting legislation in clinical practice, which inevitably results in the intentional death of another human being. According to the Australian Medical Association position statement on voluntary euthanasia in 2016, doctors have an ethical duty to care for dying patients so that death is allowed to occur in comfort and with dignity. However, the AMA believes that doctors should not be involved in interventions that have as their primary intention the ending of a person's life. A survey undertaken in 2016 by the AMA of 4,000 doctors showed that only 38% of doctors believe they should be involved in voluntary euthanasia practices. Concerns now exist about the impact on doctors of their responsibilities under voluntary euthanasia legislation. According to a review in 2006 by NCBI of doctors who participated in voluntary euthanasia in Oregon, where voluntary euthanasia was legalised in 1997, doctors describe being profoundly adversely affected, being shocked up by the suddenness of the death, being caught up in the patient's drive for voluntary euthanasia, and feeling isolated. By having voluntary euthanasia legislation implemented in South Australia, in a country where doctor suicide rates are already higher than the national average, according to a national survey of doctors by Beyond Blue in 2019. There is therefore a significant risk of adding further adverse effects for doctors. And so, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we the Negative team most definitely believe that voluntary euthanasia legislation should not be implemented into South Australia. Thank you.
Madam Chairman.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Lucy Rosen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman. The topic for tonight's debate is that voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented in South Australia. As the affirmative team, we strongly agree with this statement. Tonight, as second speaker, I'll be discussing the disadvantages of the current South Australian healthcare system and how until they provide facilities where elderly people have low cost but high quality facilities, why shouldn't they have the choice to die with dignity? I will also be discussing how every other state in Australia is currently trying to implement voluntary euthanasia. However, before I elaborate on my points, I will point out the flaws in the opposition's argument. The first speaker made the point that this is a nationwide issue. However, as I will elaborate in my points, every other state in South Australia is currently trying to enact voluntary euthanasia, and South Australia is the odd one out here. They also tried to mention that the introduction of voluntary euthanasia would impose on a doctor's duty to kill. However, this is invalid as these doctors are not forced into participating in voluntary euthanasia if they do not feel comfortable. No doctor should be forced into participating in voluntary euthanasia, but also, no patient should be forced to suffer immensely when there could be a potential way out of this suffering. Now, on to my first point, why all other Australian states are positively enforcing voluntary euthanasia. As of the 4th of September, all states and territories in Australia are investigating the merits of voluntary euthanasia. Although they are all at different stages of implementing it into their legislation, they all have the same outlook on this topic, which is positive. Beginning with Victoria in June of 2019. It's eventually expected that 150 people will access this scheme annually, according to the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. The process to be eligible for this is extremely controlled. To be eligible under the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act, a person 18 years or older must have an advanced disease causing them unacceptable suffering and is likely to cause their death in 6 months. According to the Victorian VAD policy, their pain and suffering must be such that it cannot be relieved in a manner that the person considers tolerable. This process cannot be completed in less than 10 days, and the person can change their mind at any time, hence it being voluntary. Besides, Victoria is not the only state considering implementing the Voluntary Assisted Euthanasia Act. In SA at the moment, the government has undertaken an inquiry into end-of-life choices. The ACT government responded to an end-of-life choices report recently. They also agreed to all 24 of its recommendations, thus supporting legalising euthanasia. Queensland is in the midst of an inquiry into end-of-life care and voluntary euthanasia. Earlier this year, the VAD Bill of 2019 easily progressed to the consideration in detail stage in WA's Legislative Assembly. Need I go on? Of course, this doesn't mean that South Australia should blindly follow suit to the other states, but the fact that all of these states are expressing their interest to legalise euthanasia provides strong evidence that South Australia should also consider the numerous positive benefits that voluntary euthanasia brings. My second point is that the South Australian healthcare system is far from perfect, and until the South Australian government can confidently say that there are facilities accessible to all people that are of high quality, that there should be an option for those in pain at the end of their lives for euthanasia. According to a study undertaken by Dutch researchers Martin T. Muller and Gerrit van der Wal called Euthanasia and Old Age, over 70% of those seeking voluntary euthanasia are in the 60 to 90 age range and wish to end their lives due to them being at the end of their lives. In South Australia, support and facilities for elderly people is shocking. In June of this year, 2 South Australian aged care facilities remained open despite failing 21 of 44 necessary outcomes, including staff development, clinical care, specialised nursing needs and behavioural management, according to ABC News. If this is the standard that South Australia's aged care is held to, is this really where we want the elderly people of our society spending their final days? And is it any wonder that those living in extreme pain at the end of their lives, living in these facilities, wish to die with dignity rather than a slow, drawn-out death at the hands of somebody else? Until these facilities are held to a higher standard, and SA's healthcare system can guarantee that those in extreme pain at the end of their lives are given the best treatment possible, euthanasia should be an option. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the point of euthanasia is not to cause death, but to end suffering. We as the affirmative team believe that voluntary euthanasia should be an option in South Australia. The other Australian states are already starting to implement legislations into their government for a reason, so South Australia should consider it too. On top of this, the standards for healthcare in South Australia are unacceptable, and until this changes, voluntary euthanasia should be a choice for those living in pain or at the end of their lives in South Australia. Thank you.
Madam Chairman.
I call upon second negative speaker, Matthias McCarthy.
Good evening, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented in South Australia. We of the negative team without a doubt believe that this statement is false. Our first speaker has already informed you that the legislation is complex and needs to be seen as a national rather than a state issue, and has talked about the adverse effects on doctors of having the responsibility of enacting voluntary euthanasia legislation. As second speaker, I will be explaining to you the very real dangers involved with the complexity of safeguards for patients and their families and issues of competency. Our third speaker will rebut some of our team's case. Before I begin my points, I'll rebut some of the points put forward by the opposition. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that mentally unwell patients are not able to access voluntary euthanasia. But as I will discuss in my second point, mentally unstable people can, and there are articles to back it up. The second affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that people are dying with dignity by using voluntary euthanasia. This is wrong because patients can still die with dignity by going into palliative care and also die whilst also being surrounded by family during the last moments of death. Now to my first point. There are many objections to the introduction of voluntary euthanasia legislation in SA, one of which concerns the extent to which safeguards are able to prevent misuse of the process. In Victorian law, there are 68 safeguards to be met for those who want to die. That's 68! And one of these safeguards is that patients who do not have an Australian citizenship cannot be voluntarily euthanised. Their rights should be considered here too. There is a very real possibility that one or two of these may be missed. This is simply too complicated and may lead to a person being allowed to die when it is not the best course of action. In Victoria, there is a task force establishing how the system will work. This is a clear indication that policymakers themselves do not have answers to this issue. Furthermore, the 68 safeguards do not prevent the misuse and misery, do not prevent the upset and misery of family and friends, medics and other sick people who are affected by these deaths. Their rights should be considered as well. The other concern about safeguards is the perceived inevitability that legislation would be expanded over time, so a broader group of people would have access to it. Whilst this may be viewed as a slippery slope argument, there is real evidence that this has happened in other countries. In an article cited, The Case Against Physician-Assisted Suicide and Voluntary Active Euthanasia by Tan Xiao, it states there remains a real possibility of the extension of euthanasia to the disabled and the elderly. The article states that Belgium removed the age restrictions for euthanasia in 2014 to allow competent, terminally ill young people to access the procedure. A Telegraph article by Henry Samuel recites Belgium authorising euthanasia for terminally ill 9 and 11-year-olds, which is the youngest case worldwide. This raises the real concern that people will utilise voluntary euthanasia for diseases for which cures may yet be found, or even that people will restrict their efforts to find cures. For this reason, and to ensure that there are adequate safeguards in place, voluntary euthanasia legislation should not be implemented. My second point this evening will cover the issues of competency. If voluntary euthanasia legislation is introduced for people who are competent, how do we protect those who are not? An article titled SA's Reasons for Voting Down Euthanasia in www.theconversation.com.au defines competence as a person requesting voluntary euthanasia fully understanding the decision. 2 doctors who have sworn by the Hippocratic Oath never to do harm must assess the requesting person and inform them of the palliative care options available, and have a moral duty to describe alternatives to ending life. Palliative care already helps Australians die with dignity. Good palliative care is the best alternative to euthanasia. In an article titled Euthanasia and Where It Could Soon Be Legal by Emily Brooks, Dr. Linda Sheehan, a palliative care specialist, states that 70 to 80% of palliative care specialists are opposed to the legislation of assisted death. It is important that a person is made fully aware of all their options and that the vulnerable and incompetent are protected. Ladies and gentlemen, how is a terminally ill patient supposed to comprehend the enormity of decisions relating to life and death when in such circumstances, suffering the pressures of guilt about being a burden, worried about their own well-being? It is unlikely that people make a rational decision fully understanding these implications, and for these reasons we, the Negative Team, resolutely believe that voluntary euthanasia legislation should not be introduced in South Australia. Thank you.
Call upon the third affirmative speaker, Ruby Deacon.
Good evening, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that voluntary euthanasia should be legalised and should be implemented in South Australia. We, the affirmative team, believe that this statement is true. Tonight, the opposition's case has revolved around 4 key themes. These are that voluntary euthanasia should be considered in the whole country, the well-being of doctors, the family impact of this euthanasia, and the abused right of the patients. Under the theme of voluntary euthanasia being considered for the whole country, the first speaker has tried to tell you that it should be considered for the whole country. However, this is not relevant to the topic, as this topic is specifically about the legislation being implemented in South Australia. The second speaker also spoke about the global issues of this. However, this again is not relevant to the topic. Under the theme of the well-being of doctors, the first negative speaker tried to convince you that euthanasia shouldn't be legalised due to the adverse effects it has on doctors on doctors' well-beings, and has mentioned that doctors' suicide rates are high enough as it is. However, this is a red herring fallacy, as doctor suicide rates have nothing to do with the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia. The first speaker has also stated, and I quote, "This is not a debate on the pros and cons of voluntary euthanasia. However, this is exactly what this debate is about. This is about why we should and why we should not implement the voluntary euthanasia legislation in South Australia." Under the theme of the abused right of patients, the second speaker from the negative team has stated that euthanasia could be misused. However, as our second speaker Lucy has said, there is a strict procedure involved in euthanasia, and not everyone is eligible. Doctors and family members will all be helping to make sure that a correct decision is being made. Also, in the definition that the opposition agreed to, it stated that only euthanasia could be provided to certain people. The problem is not implementing euthanasia, but instead making sure that people use this correctly. The second speaker has also argued that choosing euthanasia would have significant effects on their family's mental health. While this may be true, losing a family member is a tough time for anyone. Any person with a family member suffering from a painful, incurable disease is going to be emotionally damaged. Whether this person dies voluntarily tomorrow or naturally in pain within the next 6 months, everyone around them is going to be deeply affected. But the way that person dies won't stop this stress. Euthanasia may even make the grieving process easier, because knowing that their relatives inevitably close death is going to be painless could reassure family members. The second speaker has also tried to argue that patients may not be in the right frame of mind or mental state to make this decision. But to be eligible for euthanasia, a person 18 years or older must have an advanced disease causing them unacceptable suffering and is likely to cause their death within the next 6 months, or 12 months for neurodegenerative diseases. According to the Victorian VAD policy, their pain and suffering must be such that it cannot be relieved in a manner that the person considers tolerable. This process cannot be completed in less than 10 days, and the person can change their mind at any time. Hence, it is voluntary. These patients are also not the only people who are involved in making this decision. As our first speaker has already stated, family members and doctors are all involved in making this decision. Now on to my summary. Our first speaker, Bindi, has addressed how patients should have the freedom of choice to choose whether or not to use euthanasia, as it is ultimately their lives. The option of euthanasia is only given to those suffering from a disease with a 100% fatality rate, and to end the pain of that suffering. Each and every human is born free, and therefore should have the right and freedom to be able to choose voluntary euthanasia. Euthanasia also provides a safe and legal environment for the suffering and those around him. Our second speaker, Lucy, also spoke about how the states and territories of Australia are investigating the merits of voluntary euthanasia. She also mentioned the poor standard of the South Australian healthcare system. So, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, voluntary euthanasia legislation should be undoubtedly implemented in South Australia. As Patrick Ness once wrote, the end of your suffering is the most human wish of them all.
Call upon the third negative speaker, Vida Mufanini.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that voluntary euthanasia legislation should be implemented in South Australia. We, the negative team, unequivocally believe that this statement is false. Before I sum up our team's case, I will rebut the points put forward by the affirmative team. The first speaker has tried to tell you that euthanasia is credible. Although there are 68 criteria which may make euthanasia seem like it's credible, they exclude patients under the age of 18 and migrants who do not have an Australian citizenship or permanent residency. This restricts access and is an equity issue, as stated by our second speaker. The first speaker has also tried to tell you that voluntary euthanasia is the patient's choice. But there is no guarantee that the patients are not getting influenced by their family's desires. Once the patient has decided, the doctor has no way of verifying any coercion of the decision, and they have the choice to opt out of the process. The second speaker has attempted to tell you that voluntary euthanasia doesn't affect the doctors. Euthanasia is contrary to the Hippocratic Oath because they are harming patients. Even if a patient has requested euthanasia, the responsibility lies with the doctor to make the judgment. The second affirmative speaker has also linked their team case on the Victorian legislation and compared it to SA's. This is irrelevant to this debate because the Victorian legislation relates to assisted suicide, which is not the topic of this debate. The topic of this debate relates to voluntary euthanasia, which we have defined as the direct actions of one person, a doctor, causing the death of another person in order to carry out a competent person's request to end their own life. The lethal act is performed by the doctor. The second affirmative speaker also tried to tell you that euthanasia is simple and you're giving the patient what they want. Unfortunately, this is not true. The complexity of euthanasia not only relates to the 68 criteria, but also includes social, religious, moral, ethical, and financial aspects. Adding on to that, life is precious. Who are we to say that all life isn't worth the same? Just because someone is disabled, old, or terminally ill doesn't mean that they should die or feel the need to have voluntary euthanasia. The second affirmative speaker and third affirmative speaker have tried to tell you that these people are in pain and they are suffering. For a patient who is going through pain and suffering, going through the rigmarole of meeting 68 criteria is not easy to withstand. The word euthanasia is derived from the Greek word meaning easy death. The process is in no way easy. The mental well-being for a vulnerable patient who has been deemed ineligible, as they have not met the stipulated criteria, would be far too overwhelming to handle. The hope that has been given to them simply shattered. As our second negative speaker has already stated, this is where doctors can help, because they are experts in palliative care. Such doctors are best placed to decide how to manage their pain and well-being for the future and will care for the terminally ill patients. Our first speaker emphasised that voluntary euthanasia is complex and needs to be seen as a national rather than state issue to address medical inequalities between the states. She also told you about the adverse effects on doctors having the responsibility of enacting voluntary euthanasia legislation and how this can be detrimental to their well-being. Our second speaker reinforced that there are too many safeguards which are complicated and that policymakers do not have any answers to this issue. Finally, he addressed the issues of competency, explaining that in times of extreme stress, people are unlikely to make rational decisions or fully understand the implications, and that palliative care provides a better alternative for Australians to die with dignity. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we the Negative team strongly believe that voluntary euthanasia laws must be considered as a national issue rather than state issue, because policymakers have not made it clear how to safeguard public safety, and therefore palliative care is currently our best option. As I am sure our team case has convinced you, we the Negative team most unequivocally believe that voluntary euthanasia laws should not be implemented in South Australia. Thank you.